What's going on, everybody? We are back, and if you're a returning listener, I appreciate you for tuning back in. If you're a new listener, welcome to the podcast. I appreciate you tuning in. In this episode, we get to talk to one of my good friends, Dr. Dustin Wilson. He is a DPT who primarily specializes in powerlifting and strength sports. And in this discussion, we get to talk a little bit more about his nuanced views on moving through different planes of movement, as well as using energy systems development, or ESD, in powerlifting athletes. It's something that I definitely don't always think about, but he provided a ton of great points on why it is important for specific lifters. And before we begin, I do want to give a quick shout out to 110%. As you guys know, they support both me and the podcast. So if you want to try any of their supplements out, I will have a link in the description below with my code for 10% off at checkout. 110% is much more than just a pre-workout or a supplement. It's a community and a mentality, and one that I'm proud to strive and be a part of. So try anything. I promise you that you're going to like it. And lastly, if you've ever wanted to work with me or just to learn a little bit more about my coaching system, please feel free to reach out. I've included both my social media handle on Instagram and my inquiry link below in the description. Shoot me a quick question in a DM or fill out the inquiry form if you do want to apply for coaching, and I will get back to you as soon as I possibly can. I said lastly, but it's not actually lastly. This is the last thing I'm going to say. If you do enjoy these episodes and you get something from them, if you can please drop a review or a follow or a share on this episode, that would mean the world to me. It's one of my goals in 2025 to grow the podcast, and that can be done very simply through a little bit of interaction with you guys. So please do that if you do enjoy the episode. But without further ado, we will head into episode 18 of the Escalate podcast. So on today's episode, we've got Dr. Dustin Wilson. He is the founder and, one of the head coaches at Entropic Training Systems. I'm going to let Dustin do his own little introduction here, but I'm really excited to talk to him mainly about some of the, I would say, a little bit more unconventional training methods that he uses with his clients, moving people through multiple degrees of freedoms and planes of movement, as well as some of the energy systems development stuff that he's doing. I don't think we necessarily see in the powerlifting world as much as we see in like a strict strength and conditioning world. So welcome to the podcast, Dustin. If you want to give yourself a little small introduction now, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, dude, appreciate it. My name is Dustin Wilson, doctorate of physical therapy. I have been in practice now this will be year number 4, which feels kind of crazy because it still feels like I'm kind of like fresh out. Undergrad was a little bit of a pre-med exercise science mix. Been powerlifting now. I joke that's the only thing I've done in my life consistently for more than a decade. I was introduced to the sport when I was in high school. And just for a little bit of like a time reference, I graduated high school in 2014. And the first time that I ever truly did a competitive style powerlifting meet was, I believe, in 2011, where I deadlifted 525, and it was like the craziest conventional sumo, it was like a conventional stance, like a wide conventional stance, like very wide, like almost snatch grip deadlift. Like it was the ugliest thing ever, but that was kind of like my intro to the powerlifting world, and I've kind of just fallen in love with the process ever since. I went to Springfield College, where I initially went with the intention of playing football, abandoned that because I was just very much in love with the process of powerlifting and the group that was around at that school. And any listeners are aware of Springfield College, it is a meathead central up in Western Massachusetts. And there's a lot of freaks that come in and out of that school in terms of coaches, athletes, strength athletes, so on and so forth. And that kind of projected me more in my quote unquote powerlifting career, and my interest in it, especially my interest in human movement, all the sciences around it, and kind of constantly problem solving for the things that we encounter and understanding the why, because I think there are a lot of things that we will never understand about the human body, especially how we move and why things happen. But the more that we can kind of chase it and explore those unknowns, like I think it's just fun. It's fun to be wrong about it. It's fun to learn new things about it. It's fun to feel different things and just try to understand what's happening.
Yeah, I think we definitely share that interest. Obviously I'm pursuing a graduate degree in motor neuroscience, which is revolved around motor control, motor learning. And I definitely feel the same way when it comes to trying to figure out why people move the way they move and what constraints kind of make that happen, whether it's environmental or a task constraint or a physical constraint or injury or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And then helping them learn, how to move a different way. And you've been doing that through both PT and were you a strength and conditioning coach at all, or did you just strictly go into powerlifting?
I strictly went into powerlifting. It was kind of this organic thing that came about. I started kind of like working with people remotely my senior year of undergrad. And I kind of did things in like reverse order where I never really did things in person first. It was always remote first.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a lot of criticism around that. A lot of people say like, oh, it should be the other way around. But one thing that I found with that process that I went through was it made it so easy for me to learn how to cue. Because if I can get someone to understand how to achieve a position or sensation over text, it's going to make it really freaking easy in person when I can also put my hands on you and kind of manipulate you into a position more.
Yeah.
But my, but yeah, started off with the powerlifting thing remotely. It wasn't always powerlifters off the start too. It was kind of like general strength and conditioning. Like I want to be better, I want to be stronger, I want to move better, so on and so forth. And it slowly grew over time. My first competitive powerlifter was probably like in 2020, and since then we've kind of grown coast to coast, and I have a pretty strong roster now that I love. Like personality wise, they're great head to toe. But yeah, that's how things kind of started getting rolling with Entropic.
Yeah, and you guys do multiple things. You have multiple head coaches, correct? It's not just you. You have people that do what I assume is general fitness, and then I was scrolling through a little bit. Do you guys have a running coach or somebody that does a little bit more of like the race stuff?
Yeah, so right now we just brought on two new coaches, one being Destiny Breen, who is a world class powerlifter herself. She just set a deadlift world record at USAPL Nationals last year. She's become a really good friend, share a lot of common values. And then we brought on Kevin Ramos, who's more of like our running side of things, athletic side of things. Him and our assistant coach, Nick Abatangelo, who is currently in PT school as well. He's shadowed me in person before, and he's a gem. So we have those two. We have a couple other assistant powerlifting coaches, as well as another powerlifting head coach, David Klein, who's a little bit more behind the scenes. He's also a strength coach at Fairfield University, works closely with the Fairfield U's women's basketball team, who, if anyone pays attention to women's college basketball, they made it to the tournament last year. They were very competitive. I think a 30 plus win season. And then the really behind the scenes is my buddy Mike, who is kind of like the Entropic co-founder. Mike does a lot of mental performance work with special ops right now in San Diego. So that's one service we're looking to provide down the pipeline is a lot of like mental performance strategies, habit formation. How can you set yourself up to succeed outside of the gym and work on habit formation, lifestyle change, things of that nature. So yeah, we kind of are taking as much of a full circle approach as we can for the services that we can provide.
That's awesome, man. And, I can kind of see your time at Fairfield and probably being around, really good strength and conditioning coaches and really good athletes in how you coach. And one of the first topics that I want to kind of dive into is something that I almost like, I don't mean to define it as your coaching style, but you're one of the only people that I know does it. And what I'm talking about is moving people through like programmed accessories through different planes of movement, right? So we see a lot of accessory movements in powerlifting revolving around building muscle, revolving around becoming the bodybuilder inside the powerlifter, right? Because as we all know, if we can gain more muscle tissue, if we can win the hypertrophy, we're going to get stronger. Like it's a very easy process. But I think with your perspective, both in the strength and conditioning field and people around that, and as a PT, I've seen you doing med ball throws. I've seen you do, whatever lumberjack cable twist, stuff like that. And I haven't seen that from a lot of other coaches. I think it's very unique. I think it's very cool. Was that something that you saw in PT school or as a need as you were first starting as a powerlifting coach, and then you just kind of dove into that route, or was that something that, came up kind of recently?
I think it stems strongly from those who I was mentored by and those who I looked up to when I was coming out of PT school and going through it. The way I kind of view it for myself is every exercise is kind of like a shape. And there are certain shapes that we need to maintain and challenge in order to continue to feel good, right? And if you can recognize those shapes and understand how to one, cue them or set someone up so these positions and let's say muscular facilitations occur, then you can achieve a lot of things. You can flip over a lot of rocks with a simple exercise. So you can take like you said, like the goal is to build muscle usually, right? Like that's one of the fun things to do, especially if we're not working on the compounds. You can take something as simple as a single arm dumbbell row and get so many benefits out of it, whether it be even like from like a rehabilitative standpoint or like a restorative standpoint, all while driving a high intensity stimulus out of it. So it's like, all right, do we have one hand and knee on the bench, or are we standing up and we have like a staggered stance? If we're in a staggered stance, do we have, let's say if we're rolling the right arm, do we have right leg back or right leg forward? What are we cueing from the left leg? If the left leg's forward and we're rolling the right arm, are we cueing anything from the hip? Because in a way, you're kind of challenging hip stability from that standpoint too. You're challenging, if you really want to get into it, like lat integration to opposite side glute, that posterior sling, if you want to talk slings and stuff like that. Like there are so many layers that you can add on to these exercises and be able to see it. Doesn't mean you always have to explain it, right? Like the athletes that you work with don't need to understand everything that you're doing, but they need to understand it enough so they know the intent behind what they're doing. Because if they know the intent, then they're obviously going to get more of an outcome from it, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm sure coming from like your background too, with the neuro background, it's like you're probably seeing things with a crazy lens from like a motor learning standpoint, so forth. And you learn through trial and error what is necessary for people to understand, or what do they need to understand based on personality type. Like how deep do you need to get with them for it? But even something as simple as like a single arm row, curls, lat pull downs, your split squat setup, you can manipulate the shape of all these exercises to get the desired stimulus that you want. That could be rehabilitative, strengthening. It can nail everything if you set it up in the correct way.
Yeah, and I really like that perspective that you have when it comes to having the client understand as much as they need to, right? Because I think that there are a lot of people, and for better or for worse, we're in a time right now in powerlifting where information it's saturated. It's great. Yeah. Like that's amazing. We love having more information. I mean, we love to learn things, but I think that without the proper intent, like you said, without knowing the proper intent of it, a lot of people start getting really confused. And these tools that are supposed to be used as singular tools within a toolbox of multiple things, when we talk about, rib cage position and load management and, different correctional drills or positional drills that challenge a specific position or accessory movements, all of those are different things. But a lot of people seem to, maybe for lack of better words, kind of focus on just one, right? They think that just the correctional positional exercise is going to give them exactly what they need, when in reality, it's going to be that plus the load management, plus the exercise selection, plus, a multitude, plus, cueing some sort of different, movement outcome. It's everything. Yeah. And so when you're talking to your clients and you're giving them these drills, or maybe not drills, but, exercises that, challenge these different positions in powerlifting, are you specifically looking at it from a muscle building standpoint, or are you, grabbing somebody and you're like, because what I've seen you post sometimes, you're like, okay, we're going to do some, behind the back med ball throws, and we're going to do some like straight up train triple extension, kind of learn how to produce force out of the ground, out of that big toe into the air, box jumps. Like you've dove into the plyometric world before. How does that play a role in, one, allowing the client to understand what they're doing and why they're doing it, and two, the purpose of that?
I think it all starts back to like the initial assessment, understanding what type of athlete you have in front of you. Because when the people that we have that enter the powerlifting world come from so many different backgrounds. I have ones that were high level, like volleyball athletes, or more like aerial athletes, or ones that weren't athletes at all. And nature versus nurture, that kind of influences how they then interact with a barbell, because the way we produce force underneath a barbell or with a barbell in our hands is completely different than how we produce force in a lot of our athletic environments, right? Um, so yeah, early on with the assessment, what kind of athlete were they? What kind of things have they been exposed to throughout their lives? What kind of personality type are they? Do they need these interventions to, one, keep them stimulated, or two, like, is this going to feed forward more into the things that they're good at while removing the intensity that can be associated with adding external load to it? And I think that's a big thing that I like using, especially in off-season work, whether it be like low grade plyos, med ball work. Like, you're taking away the intimidation of like having to load a barbell on your back, just as like an example. You're taking away that stress of like, oh, I gotta go through this axial loading again. It's like, nah, let's just grab a ball and throw it at the wall, because no matter how old you are, it's gonna feel good to throw shit.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, you're shifting the intensifier, right? Like, you're no longer worrying about the load so much. Now you have this velocity-based movement where velocity is the intensifier, and it's not going to be super exhausting. And then it's also a way to kind of like train energy systems, so on and so forth. But I really like using it in the sense of like, I know this is going to give a positive feedback loop to this athlete. So just as an example, this past year at Northeast Regionals USAPL, one of my girls that was competing, I literally had her jump roping before her squats, because getting her heart rate up and getting that little slight oxidative stress has proven in her training to be beneficial for her. And she's always been at her best when she's also doing something athletic outside of her training. So I'm just trying to keep that similar nature of like what she's used to being exposed to as a way of facilitating her performance.
Yeah, you keep coming back to this these two words, personality type. When you're answering these questions, I want you to I want to know what it means for you, talking about whether it's an athlete's personality type or just, being that somebody comes from an athletic background, right? What was
Yeah.
their, role, or were they the quarterback? So they're used to making the decisions, or were they the offensive lineman? They're more there for the support. They're there to help drive the play. Or, from just a client perspective of somebody that maybe wasn't in athletics, kind of breaking down like, okay, does this person need to know everything about the exercise that I'm giving them? Or can I just tell them, hey, this is how you do it really, really hard, work really, really hard, and then they're fine. Because I think it's an important thing to note, and something that, obviously you're saying right now is important that I don't hear a lot of other people talk about, right? So if you could just break that down for me real quick on how you kind of seek out these different personality types, and then some of the strategies you use to find the best way to coach them or cue them based on what you find.
Yeah. One thing that I've found personally as a clinician is the more that you can relate to a human, understand who the human is, the better the outcome you can get from them. You can give someone the perfect exercise prescription, the perfect load management, the perfect everything that, like you mentioned before, all those variables that can contribute to someone succeeding, whether it be in a rehabilitative standpoint or a performance standpoint. You can give them everything perfectly, but if you're not understanding who they are and what it means to, one, provide value to them, or two, truly what their goals are or their communication style, there's going to be a miss in translating what you're doing to their success. So with, let's say in a rehabilitative standpoint, understanding value. Like, some people are coming to you because they maybe they have been failed by PT systems before, and they don't want to go through the gamut of like, oh, here's your same standard process over and over again. Whereas other people are coming in and they just need to move, and that's going to be the value, and they're going to get a lot from just like you talking to them and getting them through very basic movements. Where on the other side of things, it's like, all right, we need a lot of attention. You need to feel like I am fully invested into you and what I am giving to you from an exercise standpoint. And knowing that from the client perspective, that's going to give them the trust and the buy-in to you to succeed. I might even miss on the exercise prescription standpoint, but their trust might slightly override that. Um, so giving them the perception of like, all right, I'm understanding who you are and I'm hearing you is the initial process in having the trust. Because if you don't trust your coach or clinician, like you're not going to succeed either way. I think personality type is huge, and we were introduced to a lot of different like questionnaires and stuff like that when we were in PT school, kind of understanding like what type of like literally personality type quizzes. And it was something like I kind of like understood, kind of like took it with like a grain of salt, like, oh yeah, this makes sense. Like it kind of fits everybody, like where everybody was grouped into is like where they group into. And I think it's something that I have intuitively learned how to recognize, like recognizing people's body language, the way they like to communicate. Some people aren't big communicators and that's all they need. I'm sure you've experienced this with a lot of your clients. Like some people are like texting you literally during like their training sessions, and others you have to like text and be like, hey, did you train at all this week? And they're like, oh yeah, nailed all 5 training days this week. Like things are going great. Everyone has different means of what they need, and being able to acknowledge that and provide value and not trying to like overstep those boundaries either. Like if they don't need that much communication, you don't need to communicate with them that much. Know what the athlete needs, and being able to just meet them where they're at, I think is huge in terms of facilitating their success.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that, that perspective. And I think that it's one, like I said earlier, that not a lot of people talk about too much, at least in the world of powerlifting. Maybe in the world of other sports, it's a much bigger thing. You've got sports psychologists that, that's their entire job, is breaking down who the athlete is and then understanding from that perspective, like this is what I tell the coaches on how to treat that athlete. And there's people that have been full-time staff for professional sports teams across the world that is their only job. That's all they do, is just say like, okay, this is their personality type. This is how you need to coach them. Like you need to tell them that they're not shit, or, you have those people where they're like, you need to praise them because that's the only way that you're going to get the best out of them. If we can steer the conversation a little bit more back to the training side of things, right?
Yep.
You had mentioned your client, I forgot her name, but you had mentioned that she was doing some sort of like jump roping right before her squats, because you had noticed in, previous training that, as she, had a little bit of oxidative stress, as she, got her heart rate up, that's when she performed best, especially in training. You had mentioned something on your Instagram a while back where you were asking people if they think that their warm up is enough. And we had talked about this a little bit beforehand where, there's kind of 2 camps, and I'm much like you, where I'm in both of them. Where, you've got the camp of people who are like, what the fuck are you doing spending 30 minutes on a warm up? Like, you don't need to do that. Just get under the bar and hit it like 30 times and you'll be fine. I mean, I tell a lot of my clients, they'll come up to me and be like, my hip kind of hurts. I'm like, okay, what warm up are you on? And they're like, oh, I'm on 1 red. And I'm like, okay, maybe you like get to 3 reds and tell me how you feel. Because guess what?
Give it a chance.
Yeah, give it a chance. Because guess what? You're going to warm up and you're going to feel better. But then there's also the case and the standpoint of like, okay, we need to be able to have a warm up that can achieve certain positions, that can get people physiologically and psychologically prepared for the session. And it felt like, at least in that post, that you were more so on the latter. You were more so on the make sure that you're getting physically ready, make sure that you're getting psychologically ready, make sure that you're able to get into these positions, rather than the just get under the bar. And like I said, you told me, before we started this call, that you've been in both camps and you currently are in both camps. I think all coaches should be in that mindset. But within that specific post, I want you to just maybe talk a little bit about what you meant by making sure you're doing enough, and then give the perspective of people who might be doing a little bit too much as well.
So the irony of that post is that day, I think I overdid my warm-ups. I was feeling really, really good and kind of like bouncing and froggy. And I was like, damn, let's like run around a little bit. Let's do some low grade plyos before we squat. And I honestly think I expended a little bit more excitement during my warm-ups than I really wanted to. And I think it took away from my performance, and that's totally okay because it's a learning process. And I
Mhm.
think that's one thing that I try to instill with a lot of my clients is what are your markers to good performance? Like when you have your good days, can you recognize the things that you were feeling or like the habits that led up to that contribute to how you feel and what you needed to do from a warm-up perspective? So whenever I start with someone new, I kind of give them like a baseline of like, all right, this is what your movement prep or warm up is going to be like, and how do we then skew it over time? Are you becoming aware of the things that you need on a daily basis based on your lifestyle? So like, are you seated all day in front of a computer screen all day? Are you going to need a little bit more of a mobility, something active to get you prepared for the task at hand? What's your relative skill level with the lifts? And I think that's a huge one to hit on too. So like for me, I'm a one trick pony and with my deadlift, right? Like that's the one thing I'm good at. I think I could lose my mind entirely and I'd still know how to pick 405 up off the ground. There are days where I can go in and I can literally just walk up to the bar and do nothing beforehand and things will feel great. And there are some days where I need to be more aware of like how I feel and not ignore it and warm up just like a little bit, whether it be like a sensory based thing, a little bit of maybe like a metabolic based thing, something that gets me ready and physically prepared to then take on the task that I have at hand that day. I know there's no shot in hell I'm ever going to have a good squat day without doing some sort of warm up beforehand because I know what I need from like a mobility, a sensory awareness standpoint, an execution standpoint. There are things that I need to check off before I squat. Very rarely does a squat ever feel good naturally for me, and I've become aware of that. And I try to make my athletes aware of all those things too. Like, all right, hey, like if it's first thing in the morning, you're not used to squatting in the morning, let's do something to wake yourself up a little bit. Maybe something that has like a motor task involved, a coordination task, something that kind of wakes you up from a sensory motor standpoint, involving your vision, involving proprioception, so on and so forth. And a lot of these interventions have been stemmed from one of my friends, a Springfield College guy who works with some pretty high level athletes in this sense. And he kind of made me more aware of like, oh, like the brain's role in all of our processing and how we can kind of wake it up from a different cortices standpoint. And back to one of our initial points in this conversation is like sometimes the athlete doesn't need to be aware of that, but they need to be aware of like if you give them this intervention, how does it make them feel? And I'm sure you've given people things before where it's like almost like a light bulb moment. You hear in their voice, they're like, "Oh, like I feel this," or like, "Oh, like this has created some significant difference to them," or it doesn't at all, and the light bulb still shut off. If the light bulb still shut off, either one, they didn't do it correctly, or two, it isn't what they needed, and you can just ditch it. But those light bulb moments are the exercises where I'm like, yes, this is going to work for you. Let's keep this in our arsenal. So when you need it and need to call upon it, we have it.
Mm-hmm. No, I like that a lot. And, I have had those moments. I think one of the funniest ones was with myself, and it wasn't even like warm-ups per se. I think it was about 2 years ago when I first started getting into, running a little bit. And for people that don't know, I've ran a half marathon, in the middle of powerlifting training, did a whole half marathon prep, stuff like that. And before that, I was training to PR my 2 mile, right? And so I was running 4 days a week, and I was, full blast, still being coached by Sean, like straight up trying to get as strong as possible.
Yeah.
And I've always dealt with like really weird hips. Like I follow a very normal, left AIC pattern where I'm just like, wow,
There it is.
yeah, it's just like, wow, my left hip does not want to move at all. Like does not want to go into internal rotation half the time, doesn't want to go into external rotation either. It's just broken. And I started running and I realized, wow, like my hip doesn't feel bad anymore. I wonder why. And it's like, oh, maybe because I'm going through like a loading mechanism, you know, thousands and tens and hundreds of thousands of times over the week as I, take each step on that, left leg and I absorb force and then I propel and all of those things that we know are important in the gait cycle.
Yeah.
And it's challenging this position for me, and it's making my hip feel good. And it got to the point where I sat down with, one or two of my clients, and I was like, hey, before you, like, you kind of had the same issue that I do. Like, your hips are all fucked up. And every single little correctional drill, left adductor pull back or anything like that is not really gained a lot of traction for us. So I'm like, before you train tomorrow, tonight, I want you to jog like 2 times around your block. Or like maybe jog around your gym like the first thing you do when you get there. And they did it and they came to me and they were like, hey, my hip felt really good. I'm like, okay, now I know what we can do. Now I just
I
need
love
you to do
that.
like some bounds, like something that you can do that's maybe a little bit less, energy, a little bit more energy efficient, right? Like if you're jogging a couple times around the gym, you're going to have some sort of, physiological stress that happens in the
Yeah.
muscles. And especially before like a heavy, peaking week 4 squat session, you don't really want your athletes doing that. But something that's really easy is, most gyms have nowadays they have a turf space that's like 10 to 20 yards long. It's like, okay, just do some, one leg bounds down and back, and that's it. And
Yeah.
all of a sudden, they're getting all of the same things. They're getting that compression, and then they're also getting all of that expansion from, exploding off the ground and going into that next jump. They're getting the feel of maintaining midfoot control because, they're having to land on one foot. And it's very, like I said, these things are very unconventional. But at the end of the day, these are tools, and they're tools that don't work for everybody. I'm not going to tell all of my clients, hey, go do single leg bounds before you squat. But for a certain amount of them, it's really going to fucking work. And for those people that it does work, it works really, really well. And so I'm right there with you, dude. I think that, being able to understand what the athlete needs and then also, due to their personality type, how they can achieve these specific things is extremely important. And whether it be from, educating them on a PRI drill or whether it be from telling them like, hey, just squat, like just take the bar like 30 times. I mean, that's generically my bench warm up is, people will be like, what are you doing? I take the bar 60 times in a set. I go like 20 regular grip, 20 close grip, 20 super wide grip. And that's it. And I feel really, really good. And that's all I really need. But I know on squat, I need way more. My warm ups, almost 20 minutes long. But that's what I need because, I'm getting old, stuff like
Yeah.
that.
And being able to recognize that and like practice it over time, right? Like how many times you've had an athlete on game day, like on meet day, be like, hey, what should I do for warm up? And it's like you shouldn't be doing anything really different from what you're
Yeah.
used to doing.
Yeah.
This should be a ritualistic process. But I like the point that you made about running versus let's say a highly cued positional drill that may have like some PRI background to it.
Mm-hmm.
You're they're very opposite in nature where one is very autonomous, one is very rhythmic and flowy, and the other one is very structured and rigid and requires a lot of attention. And some people just don't have the capacity for it, or it's not going to stick for them. Whereas something that's running based, where it's like it's natural, it's promoting that back and forth expansion compression, it can be exactly what they need. I've seen it have the same effect for someone with a right-sided, basically like a shoulder impingement, proximal bicep irritation that was going on for months. Tried to address through road. It was a powerlifter. Tried being addressed through load management, so on and so forth. He then got into, I think it was like half marathon training, and within like a couple weeks, things resolved itself. But the things that he was achieving, like upon assessment with him, the one thing that really helped him diminish symptoms was we facilitated tricep from a protracted scapular position.
Mm-hmm.
And he was like, holy shit, like one, this is hard for me to hold, like shaking, just holding like basically an isometric against a wall. But then cleared up any symptoms he really had with a push-up. And he didn't really stick to any, like we didn't have him do like specific movement prep or like PT exercises on a daily basis, but he just kept with the running. And I think that gave him kind of like the scapular expansion on the posterior aspect of his back that he needed to get things freed up and promote basically the opposite of what his powerlifting training was kind of shaping him to be. It's like, all right, you're probably just so compressed front to back through the means of your training. give yourself some sort of training that promotes the opposite of that, and that's just going to open up the space that you need.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes back to, you talking about personality types, I see that, a lot of people that were these kind of bouncy athletes, you've got track athletes, you've got football athletes, basketball athletes. If we can continue having them do those things that they were trained probably longer than they were in powerlifting to do, like, let's be honest, a lot of these kids that come from football, they were trained to be pretty springy, pretty like fast twitch from probably the age of like 8, and in Texas probably like the age of 4, just ridiculous.
Yeah, right.
And so if we, I mean, that's by the time that they start powerlifting, which might be, their freshman year of college or maybe the last year of high school, they take it seriously. It's like they've got anywhere from 10 to 14 years of training a specific way, of being rhythmic, of being, in this kind of like interlimb or bimanual coupling movement, that then all of a sudden they are directly in one plane, sagittal plane only. That's all we care about. And if you're a coach that, it's kind of in that situation where you're like, okay, I know these things. I know that I can, have my clients move a different way. And I know that, I need to have them move in these reciprocal, actions of having rib cage movement or pelvis movement, because we've all seen the post by Connor Harris or some of these other guys where it's just like, if you can get the rib cage to move well, 9 times out of 10, you can get the pelvis to move well. If the rib cage is the problem, then move the pelvis and maybe it'll free some space up. What are some, I guess my question is, what are some very easy things, whether it be like extensive med ball throws or just like we were talking about, just a little bit of a jog around the gym beforehand, or an air bike. I think that's one of my favorite things in the world. It's an air bike that you can just have somebody go on with their hands and their feet, back and forth. And right there, that's a lot of rib cage movement that's going back and forth. What are some very entry level things that you think almost everybody could do? And I hate to pin it that way, because at the end of the day, not everybody needs it. But in a sport where we are, super compressed, and we are only moving in one plane, and almost everybody does need to move in these multiple degrees of freedom. Is there anything that you think could benefit everyone? Is there, or when you do find the solution, like whether it be a med ball throw or whether it be bounds or whether it be other things, what is the entry level? Like, is it an extensive plyo, or are you trying to be a little bit more intensive? Are you trying to, increase intensity? Because you did talk about that previously.
I think if I had to pick the lowest hanging fruit, I would go for, all right, what feels good and what facilitates function at a very low level. And so I don't steal your answer. Yes, I love fan bikes. I think they are like a cheat code. Um, if we're talking strictly in the sport of powerlifting and the things that come along with the nature of training from this standpoint, very low level, I would look at anything passive and side lying. Because if we can get someone into side lying, it's going to help promote some expansion front to back. A couple of years ago, if you're familiar with Pat Davidson,
Mm-hmm.
Pat is a Springfield guy and a very big influence on me. I actually missed him by I think a year, and I have since been able to see him in person twice, and it's one of the best seminars I've ever had. Like, completely dialed in for an entire weekend. I have not paid attention for that long of a standpoint in a very long time. He made a post a couple of years ago where he had someone lying on their side and he just put heavy sandbags on their hips and their
remember
ribs.
this.
Dude, and
people lost their minds.
People were so upset. They're like, this ain't it. This is trash. And it's like, no, this like actually makes so much sense.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, like, we're all just bags of fluid with like electricity and bones in us.
Yeah, it's crazy to think about.
I know. We're all subject to the same laws of physics. And the nature of everything we do as powerlifters squeezes us front to back, basically expands us out into our frontal plane and like turns us into like kind of like a crab. Like, eventually there's going to be a point where like people can only move side to side because they're so compressed. And if you take them and just put them on their side and just squeeze them in the opposite direction and facilitate usually breath work to then promote some relaxation, some shape change. Like you can see range of motion change at the shoulders and the hips. It's like, all right, sweet. Like we had this change, but then how do we sustain it? Right. And you can sustain it through kind of like your accessory selection. Like what are we challenging from a position standpoint? Like, are we actually accessing the positions we opened up from these drills or not? So I did introduce this concept to some of the guys at the gym I train at and coach at. I had him just lie on his side. I first took him through like some passive range of motion assessment, like, all right, do you feel anything here? Like, is there anything pinchy, blah, blah, blah. Typical like hip internal rotation limitation. He's a 120 kg kid, so I grabbed like a 120-pound sandbag and literally just placed it on the top of his hip, had him lie on his side. I was like, I want you to relax and just breathe normal for 30 seconds. That's all we did. Took the sandbag off, had him lay back down, hip was freed up, and he was like, what the hell did you just do to me? And sometimes that's all you need. Like you need some sensory input. You need to just get squeezed in the opposite direction, right? Mm-hmm. But I remember when Pat made that post and everyone was like roasting him for it. And it's like, no, this actually makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. No, I 100% agree. And for people that don't know about Pat Davidson, I highly, highly recommend. I've read it before. I probably need to reread it. I haven't read it in so long. He has a book called, I just looked it up, A Coach's Guide to Optimizing Movement, Rethinking the Big Patterns. My old coach, Sean Noriega, he helped him actually edit that book. He was in the whole mentorship program with him that, they kind of went through and used that book as to basically teach this group of coaches. And through that group kind of helped him edit it and get that book out. So good. So good, whether you're a strength and conditioning coach, whether you're a powerlifting coach. It taught me everything that I needed to know at the time about, plyometrics and how to use plyometrics for, my athletes when I was in basically like a strength and conditioning strict kind of job. Super, super good book. Also very controversial person. Also very mantra based. I love Pat. He's one of those guys where it's like, okay, you need to remember that there's a really big picture and he's just part of that picture, because people can get enveloped much like they do with other people like Connor Harris or Sam Spinelli, where it's just like, oh no, this is the only thing. And it's like, no, like this is like 10% of the pie. Right.
Yeah. He's a very good example of what I think we all should strive to be, because I believe in that book, in the intro, he's saying like, this is my life's work and I want it to be challenged. Like the only way that fields are going to progress is for ideas to be challenged. And for me to put forth this piece that is considered my life work and let it be vulnerable, I think more people need to be that way. Like let your ideas be vulnerable, because we're all wrong to some extent. Like every idea that we're going to share is going to have holes in it, no matter what. And if someone is able to constructively point out those holes and expose them, it's only going to make you better. And it's going to make ideas better. It's going to challenge things and force them to evolve. And that's the only way like our fields of like rehab and performance are going to change, is if people are willing to be vulnerable, but more importantly, are people able to actually give constructive criticism and not just attack ideas.
Yeah. And on that point, something that I, before we hopped on this call, something that I wanted to challenge you about, was, and, I gave this to you as a topic for this. And so I assume you have something ready to as a rebuttal, but I saw on your story, maybe like a month ago or a couple weeks ago, that you had one of your clients doing an EMOM bench paired with like a bike sprint, if I remember correctly, or something like that. And I'm going to be honest, I looked at that and I said, Dustin, I was like, buddy, what are we doing here? Right? Because from my perspective, I look at, something like singles on bench press being skill practice, and I look at that from a standpoint of, okay, if I give somebody 5 singles, I want them to, really focus on those, because 9 times out of 10, if we're hitting a single, it's going to be higher load than their fives or sixes. And we're not going to have that interset fatigue that settles in by rep 4, rep 5, where stuff starts to get hard. It gives them the ability to really practice this, what can be a very hard movement for some people, for pausing on the chest, doing a soft touch, being able to produce force out of that position. And when I see somebody, pair that with a very stressful aerobic exercise, I'm sitting there as the motor control guy saying, like, okay, like are we getting anything from either side at this point? And so I do want to ask, like, when you are prescribing those things, because you've done them before, is it from what we, kind of talked about before, where you look at a specific lifter's personality type and you're like, okay, I feel like they'd really enjoy this. And, as we all know, the more a client enjoys training, the better that they're going to be able to trust that process, like you were mentioning earlier. And more than likely, the better results that we're going to get. Or was this just something that you were like, man, I want to try this out and see what happens? see if this is beneficial in any way, possibly,
So underlying foundation, 100% personality type. Based on the phase of training they're in, the goals, and kind of what they personally wanted out of their training, given the time of year and some other factors, right? That has been the only, I know exactly who you're talking about. I remember exactly who it was. And that has been the only time where I've had that pairing done. Normally, if I'm going to pair bench up, or if I love EMOMs, right? Or I love 10 sets of like very low repetitions paired with something more on the other end of intensive, being like a med ball throw or something kind of like plyometric based. The premise with it was a little bit experimental, but the underlying principle of why I wanted to do that was basically energy system development and reproducibility. Like, how well can you demonstrate this skill in the presence of some fatigue? And then what does that tell us from a metabolic standpoint for you? So a little bit of a background check. When I was at Springfield College, my undergrad degree was in sports biology, which was very, very Springfield College. Like, basically take pre-med and combine it with exercise science. It basically is a golden ticket to you having to go to grad school for something, because
most exercise science degrees, I always say this, I tell all of my students, I have some students that come up to me and they're like, yeah, I want to be a personal trainer. I'm like, dude, drop out. Like, what are you doing?
Yeah, exactly.
You do not need to be in college. Like, I promise you, this degree, unless you're just going into like some sort of like, you want to be a exercise physiologist and work in a lab, like, you're gonna need to get another degree. And so, like, if you just want to be a personal trainer, please drop out.
Yeah, a little side note. I think the importance of like being honest with people now about what they need from an education standpoint is like huge. Like, I've started to become very, very honest with like prospective PT students. Like, do you really want to do this? Because the cost is like just getting higher and higher. But back to the point I was making. I had a very big interest in like the molecular side of things. Like, biochem was one of my favorite courses that I took. I love the sciences. I love understanding why things actually happened. And in some of the points that you provided me before this, you're saying how like you see me using a lot of these metabolic principles with the people that I train. And you might not see that so much with other high level powerlifting coaches. And I don't think it's like a thing of like them not doing it. I think it's more so potentially people just aren't aware of it, or they're not making a point to like make it apparent. I think those principles are carried over through some of the means, like how people program. I just approach it from a different standpoint, because one of the best quotes I've ever heard was actually from Pat when he was at Springfield College running the iron sports team there. One of the freakiest human beings that have ever come out of that school, who is a world-class strongman, will deadlift over 1,000 pounds in his career, said to him like, hey, Pat, like, how come we aren't doing like what they're doing? Like, they're competing for this, they're preparing for the same competition as us, they're doing this or that, like, why aren't we doing that? And he's like, why the fuck would we be doing what someone else is doing if we're trying to be better than them? I was like,
There
you
you
know, that's a
go.
good point. If you have the principles down, you can still apply them. It's the same thing as like the exercise shape. Like if you know the shape, you can find ways to achieve it. So having that background of like I enjoy the biochem, I enjoy like the deep sciences of it. It allows me to kind of nerd out a little bit and apply these things and kind of scratch my own itch when experimenting with these different types of approaches when it comes to powerlifters. Because I think a well-conditioned powerlifter is one that is going to be able to ultimately perform better. And that's all we're chasing, right? Like our ability to show up consistently, train consistently at like a high level, and then more importantly on meet day, not get burnt out.
Yeah, I really like the point that you make, and it kind of answered my question when I was looking at that and saying like, what is going on? Was you were saying that you used it as a strategy to challenge a position or challenge a movement that might be supernatural to this lifter, right? I don't know that lifter. She might be the best bencher that you have on the team. And you were sitting there and you were like, okay, like I give her so many tempos and I give her a long pause, and she like it just keep like there's nothing that we can do to keep challenging this position. But when we do get to a psychological or physiological arousal level, on a third attempt on a 1RM, week 4 bench, something always seems to crumble a little bit, right? And there seems to be a little bit of a thing that changes either mentally or physically that doesn't allow her to maintain and create force through this specific bench press. And I think you answered the question really well when you were like, well, I just wanted to challenge her. Like it was just another way to challenge somebody, but with instead of physiological fatigue or mental fatigue or I guess it is physiological fatigue, but I mean physiological fatigue meaning like muscular fatigue.
Yeah.
We give fatigue singles for a reason. We want people to move, we want them to be challenged in that position after a hard set. But you were doing it from physiologically a cardiovascular standpoint. I think that's really cool. I think that's a really cool way of doing it because again, from my perspective in the motor learning world, you know, I look at things through constraints and movements happen through constraints. I love the dynamic systems perspective. And for those of you that don't understand what that is, I'm hopefully going to be, breaking that down in a YouTube video here soon. But
Like and
a
subscribe.
short answer of it is you have physical constraints, task constraints, and it's like physiological, task, and environmental constraints that create a movement outcome. And if you can change one of those, then the movement outcome changes, right? If
Yeah.
you change the environment, so instead of them being in their gym, they're on the meet platform. Their movement's going to change. That changes a constraint. If you change them, task constraint. If you change them from a regular pause bench press to a 2 count pause bench press, their movement's going to change. If you move physical constraints, you give them a cue of, thinking of an external focus of attention rather than an internal focus of attention. That's going to change their movement outcome. But I think that, you give a perspective of doing that in a much different world, right? Of doing that in a cardiovascular standpoint. And, I don't know this athlete. Like I said, it seems like she's somebody that maybe you were like, okay, like we need to find some way to challenge her. And we've tried it with all these other things. Let's try it with the cardiovascular stuff too.
Yeah, she's to perfectly describe her, she's very much like a golden retriever.
Yeah.
And being in that phase of her training is like very much an off season. Challenging people in different ways from a metabolic standpoint and seeing like what kind of like almost like amygdala response do you get from it?
Mm-hmm.
Like does your performance improve given that you're like your perception of this exercise is like I need to get through this quick, like my rate of force production needs to be high, so on and so forth. Like you have the individuals who need that heightened amygdala response, and with that response comes then a more excitatory state, and then how do you kind of regulate it? And you can train that. It's a very trainable thing, that cholinergic response, and that's basically how we produce strength anyways, right? Whereas you have other people who they like being a little bit more calm. They don't need that such a heightened response in order to call upon that strength. And being able to recognize that and kind of bring that out or rule it out with off-season strategies, I think is huge if you aren't necessarily in tune with who the athlete might be from a performance perspective. Um, I really like the point you made too, and like how an environment influences somebody. Um, the one of my athletes recently, I told her, I was like, you're not allowed to squat in the cage anymore, like the giant rogue rig cage. And she didn't really understand why. And then as soon as we got her out of it and onto a combo rack, she was like, I feel not like safe. I'm like, exactly. Because believe it or not, like your environment is so important. That's why, like, I'm sure you've had to tell people this too. Like, don't look at the mirror.
Yeah.
Stop using the mirror for anything, because the mirror is if you're watching yourself deadlift or squat in a mirror, you are then relying on that visual input in order to complete a motor task. And when you're on a platform, there is no mirror in front of you. You no longer have that input to then complete the motor task. So it's like, all right, how I'm going to finish this deadlift is going to be completely somatosensory, and I don't have that information in my brain. Like, I haven't trained this way. Like, I need to figure it out now on the fly when it matters most, and that's not ideal. When you go from squatting within a cage, like, you're getting this perception of like, all right, my environment is very enclosed, and like I am perceptually safe. My periphery isn't wide open. I have these things around me that gives you a better sense of like your environment. And then you put someone out on a combo rack. And I remember this. I haven't competed in now 8 years, but I remember when I stepped out there onto that combo rack, I felt so lost in space because I had been training in a like in a cage with a mirror in front of me, and then as soon as you get out there, you're like, "Holy hell! I don't know how to perform this task because my environment is so different from what I have been used to training in." And it's incredibly important. An analogy I gave someone was like, imagine you're walking on like a tight beam, right? Like a balance beam, and there's walls next to you, and those walls are maybe like 6 inches from your shoulders on each side, and you're 6 feet off the ground. If you're walking down that beam, you're going to walk with a lot more confidence knowing those walls are 6 inches away from you as opposed to 6 feet away from you, because that changes your environment. It opens it up more. You're inherently going to feel more unstable even though it's the same task. Your environment just got a little bit wider.
Yeah,
So
dude.
I'm glad you brought that point up.
Yeah, I feel the same exact way. I love squatting in a rogue rig. It's like the only way, because people will tell me, they're just like, why do you always bring the kilos over to the rig? I'm like, dude, it just feels comfy in there. Like I just feel
It does.
I feel like I got a warm
Snug.
blanket over me. And then I'll go, like right now I'm in prep, and I've been squatting in the combo as much as I possibly can. And every single time that I squat in a combo, I'm like, dude, I feel naked. Like I feel like there's nobody around me.
Yeah,
Even
that's
though
a great way to describe it.
it's the exact same thing.
Naked.
And it's really funny that you bring up the stuff with visual feedback. One of my old clients who I don't work with anymore, Alex Kano with Challenge. He when I first was starting to work with him, he would look at the camera every single time that he would squat or deadlift, because I assumed that he was filming it from like a front facing camera. And, at some point I told him, because he had a home gym, this is during COVID. I was like, okay, I'm going to have you print out this big red X and you're going to put it on your garage door. And when you squat, you're going to look at that big red X. That's all you're going to look at. And when you deadlift, you're going to look at that big red X. Bench is really easy. I just tell him to look at the bar, and so he started doing that, and all of a sudden, stuff started moving better. He started having better proprioception, etc. And it's really funny how in big movements like squat, visual feedback is almost detrimental, because it has you move in a different way, especially when you can see yourself. Because I mean, one of the projects that I worked on this year that we're currently writing a manuscript for is about the loss of visual feedback. It in the task that we use, we do an isometric force with our what we call an FDI muscle, the first dorsal interosseous, which is this little muscle right here that only does finger abduction. And for the people that are watching on video, it's the only finger that does finger abduction, and on your index finger. And this is a widely known phenomena called force drift, popularized by Mark Latosh, who's like a huge name in the biomechanics world, in the motor control world, out of Penn State. And essentially when you lose visual feedback, so say that you're holding like 40% of your max with that muscle, and then you lose visual feedback, so you lose the little dot that tells you where you're at, you drift, your force goes down because you're relying on, uh or you're relying on less reliable, but you're using less reliable feedback, right? Your proprioceptors are less reliable than your vision. Your pressure receptors, your somatosensory receptors are they're worse than vision. Vision is so powerful. But when we
Yeah.
do go into these like larger movements, we see the complete opposite, where when you do have that direct visual feedback, dude, it's really, really hard to maintain a movement. And I think that, to finish this kind of, rant off, it lies in understanding focus of attention and understanding, how we need to think about how we're moving. I talk about focus of attention a lot. It was the first thing that I really started to fall in love with in the motor control world, meaning that, if you're thinking about in cueing somebody to produce force out of their quads in a wedge for a deadlift, you shouldn't tell them to produce force out of their quads, because that is moving their focus internally. When we move our focus internally, we change our perception of our movement from unconscious, movement to conscious movement. And we want movement to be as unconscious as possible because we want to be efficient with it. And the less neural resources that we use, the more resources that we can, use in the cholinergic muscle response, like you were talking about. And instead of doing that, you tell somebody, push the ground away from you. And 9 times out of 10, they're going to achieve a better, muscle response. They're going to achieve a better position. And so it's really, really funny that you bring that up. If I can end the rant there, that'd be great, because I can talk about this for fucking hours.
Dude, we
But
could
yeah,
probably have a
feedback
whole
is
hour long.
crazy.
I was gonna say we could probably have a whole hour long conversation on vision alone. It's been something I've been diving into over the past year from a physical therapy perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I had one client recently who TMJ case, also like high external stressors, and she mentioned to me how like when she goes to drive home, she's like, I get the worst anxiety when I'm driving. I don't know why. And something we ended up boiling it down to, I was like, think about how nearsighted your job is. Like you are a desk worker all day long. Everything you do is in front of you within a screen. And the nature of like doing all these things in front of us, like back in the day, everything that we did right in front of us was like 3-dimensional, right? Now everything's 2-dimensional, nearsighted screen time. It closes off our world around us and takes away our ability to go from like near to far, open up our periphery, so on and so forth. So then when we go from that environment all day, it's like, all right, now I'm gonna, let's say, like drive to the gym. You're being inundated with all this information so rapidly and so fast, like near and far. You have to interpret like traffic, pedestrians, all these things, and it's overwhelming to the system. And your brain's kind of like trying to process it so fast and doesn't know where to put it, and then it results in this like anxious feeling. And to kind of relate this back to like, let's say even squatting is like a very vulnerable position. Like our hands are behind our heads almost, like they're back behind us. We're exposing like our chest and like our internal organs to the environment. Then it's like, oh, put 400 plus pounds on your back and then lower yourself down to the ground, stand back up. Like sick. Your brain better feel safe in order to do it, or it's not going to want to. And that can be the difference in helping someone even like achieve hitting depth. It's like, how safe do you feel doing this task? And where does that safety come from? And sometimes like really easy starting point is just their visual input. Like where are they looking? How are they interpreting it? I know the first thing that goes whenever I am maybe like subconsciously doubting my ability to do something, it's my vision. Like the first time I ever attempted over 800 on deadlift, like my eyes immediately dropped down. I lost the horizon, like immediately just started staring at the ground. And it wasn't like that in any of the sets leading up to that.
Yeah, I want to ask because it's something that I've been diving in a little bit with my own training, and I'm looking to use in my my clients' training. Do you utilize a lot? I mean, we're talking about vision. I'm thinking of vision as well as like a mental response and mental imagery, right? And having people become confident in their movement pattern simply from them, as they're setting up right before, as they're putting their headphones on, their knee sleeves on, putting their wrist straps on, having them think like, okay, this is what the end position looks like. I know that from like maybe seeing it from a third person perspective, or even having them walk through that, the 30 seconds before they walk up to the bar on a deadlift. Like, hey, I want you to think about and imagine yourself hitting this lift right beforehand. Because if we look at any other sport, mental imagery is taught across the board. You look at, I love using the example of golf because the mental imagery of golf is huge. I mean, I just started getting into golf, and the ability for somebody to hit a small little ball 400 yards and get it into a small little cup, you have to imagine yourself doing it successfully multiple times throughout the round, or else it's just not going to happen. However, in powerlifting, I don't see a lot of people doing that. Is that a strategy that you've started to use, maybe with yourself or with your clients? Because I see it as such low-hanging fruit.
Dude, it's kind of weird that you bring that up because that is something I do and it's not something I've ever talked about. So it's almost like you're in my head a little bit. Um, so I originally got these types of training concepts from my buddy Andy Triana. And I alluded to him earlier in this episode already in this conversation. Andy was another Springfield guy who was an understudy basically of Pat. And if anyone is curious about learning about what Andy knows, look, he's been on Mark Bell's Super Training podcast a couple of times. Like, Andy is an incredibly knowledgeable human being, and he makes things very digestible, even though he'll go into things like very, very in depth. And it's funny that you bring up golf too, because Andy works with a lot of guys that are like on the pro tour with like mental performance, so on and so forth. And one drill that I kind of took from him was the mental imagery drill. Like, can you imagine accomplishing a task in your head from start to finish? Can you create in your head basically like your own little world, your own little like show? Can you smell the smells that the room would smell like? Can you feel the knurling of the barbell in your hands as you're doing the task? Um, One drill that I've given people taking these concepts is, can you imagine walking down a grocery aisle? And as you walk down this aisle, it can be whatever aisle you want. 3 items are going to fall off the shelves as you're walking down the aisle. And as that item is falling, I want you to slow down time in your head and catch the item. And then as soon as you catch the item, can you then resume normal speed and repeat it for all 3 items? And for some people, it's very, very difficult. But your ability to create that world inside your head is connecting all of the cortices necessary to then perform a motor task. Because if you can't complete it up here, then you can't complete it in person. And I think you may be able to correct me on this. There was a study, I believe, I don't know when it was, but I learned this in undergrad. They basically took monkeys and they had them perform a motor task and then also watch the motor task be formed in the same motor
mirror
neuron.
neuron.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yes. Yep. And that's the premise of it. Like, you can see a motor task happen and then run that motor pattern through your head. And that's why I caution some of my lifters sometimes too. Like, don't play back your bad reps in your head. Mm-hmm. Or if you see someone on Instagram performing a bad rep, like, don't stare at it for too long because it could totally disrupt like what you know in your own head. But the training for that internal visual motor training. I've had some kids where I'm like, I want you to practice this, and he's like, one specific athlete I have, he was like, I can't. He's like, this is the hardest thing I've ever had to do. And like, it's almost like this crazy like ADHD response. Like, I can't sit here and comfortably try to create this like thing in my head. I feel like I need to like get up and do it. It's like, no, you need to sit down and focus on this.
Yeah.
We need to try to create this. We need to try to make this happen, because until you can make it happen mentally, it's not going to happen physically.
Yeah, man, I love that. And I think that's a perfect way to end this conversation. Obviously we could, like you said, we could probably talk about this stuff for hours. But I'm going to give you the opportunity to plug anything. Obviously anything that you'll have your Instagram, the Entropic website, all of that stuff, their Instagram in the description below. But I'm going to give you the opportunity to talk about what you do, and some outlets that people can reach out to you about if they want to hear more.
Yeah. Instagram handles at doc_Willie_. Largely just working with powerlifters remotely at this point. I do remote PT from like a very selective standpoint, the thing I like working with the most is the cases that are more chronic, or they feel like they have not been able to figure out a solution for what they're experiencing. I honestly think that the remote PT thing can be very difficult at times, and that's why I'm very select with like who I decide to work with. But also from like an in-person standpoint, I love the more complicated cases. I love trying to help people understand what's going on and solve these problems that they feel like they have been failed with elsewhere. But yeah, other than that, I'm just trying to share what I know and create better ideas, better conversations on Instagram. Um, my DMs are always open for people. I love having conversations. I love having my own ideas challenged. I'm totally open to that. So yeah, that's all I got.
Yeah, he also has a podcast also, The Heavyweights.
Oh yes,
Yeah.
sorry. Yeah, Heavyweights podcast. Me and my buddy Josh Horn, who is one of the best overqualified personal trainers that I know. Very good friend, would do anything for him. Yeah, check us out.
Yeah. Well, if you've made it this far, guys, thank you guys for listening. Dr. Wilson, thank you, man. You've been a pleasure to talk to.